Okay, we're back. Oh, the good ship practice. It's been a while. 2024. Here we go. Okay, so we're gonna get straight into it. So I'm gonna let the guests introduce themselves as usual, and tell us something about where they are right now. So Marlyne, over to you.
Yes, well, thank you so much for visiting me on your ship and coming up the river to the Lac Léman here in Geneva. I'm in the sociology department at the University of Geneva, and I work with, I work both with people in social sciences, but also with other people in interdisciplinary fashion. And not a lot of people here work with social practice theory, I must say, but everyone in my team pretty much does.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do then? How you work with practice theory?
Yeah, well, I think I first fell in love with practice theory when I read Elizabeth Chauve's work, and I immediately started reading Ted Chatsky's work, and I use it in my research. I really appreciate the descriptive quality of practice theory, but we can talk more about that later. And I also bring it into my teaching. I'm really lucky. I coordinate a master's program called Sustainable Societies and Social Change. And there's a applied workshop where students have to come up with a problem and think about ways of supporting transitions to more sustainable consumption. And they do that using practice theory. And I'm very fond of the change points exercise that was developed out of Manchester. So practice theory comes into teaching at the master's level. And I even have some bachelor students in a sociology of consumption course use practice theory in a journaling exercise. Journaling is a really nice way to get beyond what ChatGPT might have to say about practice theory. So ChatGPT hasn't figured out how to do journals yet, but the students do journals where they describe some of their energy using practices. And they've also been, I must say, all my students are quite keen on the theory.
Cool. Excellent. So I'm going to pass over to our resident pirate for the day. Nina?
Yes, so you already mentioned that you sort of got into practice theory by reading Elizabeth's work and Ted's work. Could you maybe tell us a bit more where and how you first encountered practice theory?
So it was in reading Comfort, Cleanliness, and Convenience. The subtitle has something to do with normality. I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's on my bookshelf behind me, and it's really a must read. I do go back to it quite a bit. And then in reading that, I wanted to sort of really understand how Chatsky apprehends practice theory. So one of the another first book I read was his book. And then a little bit later, I became very involved in the European Sociological Association's research network on the sociology of consumption. And that network has a lot of scholars working with practice theory, including Alan Ward, for example, Daniel Welsh, among others. And I want to say, really is a practice theory. Practice theory is really something that I encountered and then became really quite committed to. But I've been learning this whole time. I want to say, a week doesn't go by where I don't learn something or understand something more about the theory. So I think it's very enriching in that way. I encountered it, but it hasn't left me, and I keep learning new things as I go.
Yeah, I feel like that's just a shared experience of many people working with practices in some way. So could you maybe tell us what attracted you to practice theory in particular?
In consumption studies, when it comes to thinking about sustainability, there has been for a long time this dominant idea that either individuals will make better decisions and change their behaviors, or that somehow technologies will save the day. And of course, Elizabeth's work, Beyond the ABC, many other articles have been so fundamental in helping us move away from those approaches and have arguments against such individualized approaches, whether they're units of technology or units of people. So what attracts me is to be able to explain how much of what we do has to do with habits and routines that are not so easy to change. One line that I like to use with engineers and architects who already understand the importance of materiality is to say that the normative dimension of practices may not be something as visible as a bike lane, but it still has such a stronghold on how practices play out. So I think bringing in normativity for me is very important when I'm speaking to a certain group of people. But for others, people in the social sciences, bringing in the material dimension of practices is also very important and relevant. And of course, all these elements are interdependent, but it's sort of how practice theory allows you, starting from a flat ontology, to then sort of bring in this nuance and texture. So it has this descriptive quality that I'm very convinced by. And in some instances also, it has a bit of a prospective quality. I know not everybody is comfortable using social practice theory as a theory of change, but we have a reading club right now here with a colleague of mine, Nicolas Bayalafitte, who's an STS. We're reading Shatsky's Social Change in the Material World, and we're really trying to think of how you can operationalize social practice theory to think about experiments, interventions, or other forms of change that might take place. So I think I'm attracted to it for its descriptive quality, for the texture and nuances it brings to how people usually think about change, and for its potentially prescriptive quality of thinking about the future.
Very interesting. So you mentioned materiality and normativity and change. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about the main ideas that you're working with in your research on practices?
Yeah, this call comes at a really great time because I spent much of last week in Munich with Henrike Rau, who is a mobility sociologist, and she also works with practice theory. And we met to try and think about normativity in practices and processes of normalization, but we're both very keen on thinking about non-consumption, or how do you study empirically things that people aren't doing or shouldn't be doing. So we're very interested in the future and potential lock-in of air conditioning, for example, in European cities. So how do you study a practice that shouldn't come to be, something like that? So that was last week on normalization. And this week, I've been working with a scholar at the University of Laval called Laurence Godin. She and I had worked together on the past on food consumption, and we're writing a bit of a methods chapter on emotions and how emotions as a heuristic device, when you're putting emotions to work in your methodology, how these emotions can tell us something about the normativity of practices. So emotions not as a purely sort of cognitive psychological condition, but rather how emotions tell us something about how people feel things ought or should be done, and how they might challenge the normative ways of doing. And so so I'm working on that this week. Those are the two topics.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And with that, I'll pass it on to Elizabeth.
So I'm up in the crow's nest today, looking around, looking at the world around you. But before I get on to the question about, who else you work with, I'd like to push a bit further. Do you think practices can be changed by individuals, by interventions, or do you think that's just a waste of time?
So I know that it sounds like I'm suggesting that workshops will change the world, and I'm not suggesting that, but I do think there's something around experimenting with change that is very promising and very interesting. So in no way can a set of information create new meanings that will magically allow people to change their practices. We know this, but I was part of a European project where we recruited households to reduce their indoor temperatures. And in that case, you had people who were there on a voluntary basis. There are many biases to such an approach, but something did happen. And we wrote about this with Henrike Rau in terms of a new artifact around a new indoor temperature. And something happened when people had to deal with those 18 degrees. And what new meanings came up around sleeping comfortably, for example, or what skills and competencies did people have to put into place to dress warmly indoors? So I know we can't change the world with these kinds of experiments. And I think I'm more interested in what we can learn from them. It's not, change per se, but how we understand change and can theorize change. But to me, these forms of experimentation are quite interesting and promising as one tiny little piece of the bigger picture, of course.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there's more to talk about, but I'd like to go back. You mentioned the European Sociological Association on Consumption. So my question is about whether you're working on your own or you're part of some little tribe or clan or gathering of some kind.
Yeah.
Who do you work with on practice theory and consumption and sustainability?
Yeah, good question. I think there are a few tribes. The ESA RN5 is definitely a tribe. Many of those scholars are committed to or use practice theory. And out of the RN5, 2 tribes emerged, one around the pandemic, where a group of researchers got together and said, oh my goodness, something is happening here in relation to consumption. Let's study it. So we came up with a common interview guide. Some of us used practice theory in the classroom to understand how students were changing their practices during the pandemic. So that was one tribe led by Mary Green, who's now at Wageningen. And another tribe emerged last winter led by Melanie Jaeger in Berlin, with people like Kirsten Graham-Hansen and Arve Hansen and others. And that was about studying energy last winter from a practice theory perspective, because, for the past 10 years, I've been saying energy doesn't mean anything to people. It's the services that it provides that are important. Well, all of a sudden, energy did become significant in and of itself. And we wanted to study that. So another tribe using practice theory came together around that. And then I have my own tribe here at the University of Geneva, the PhD students and postdocs that I work with. And then there's the new journal as well, Consumption and Society, where I work with co-editors Daniel Welsh and Stefan Wallen. And we're also, through the 3 of us, all of us work with practice theory, but of course the journal is open to other.
A mini tribe.
Yeah,
that's great.
So there are different tribes.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we're coming to the end of our little port call here. So we'd like you to give us a souvenir, something to remember you or Geneva by, or what you've had to say. You've chosen something for us.
I have. I've chosen a cartoon that we've made. And it's a cartoon that describes future practices in the energy transition. It's basically taking an energy scenario and interpreting it into a moment in the life of these fictive personas living in Geneva in 2035. And we found it compelling to have people, because people identify people, but we didn't want to fall into the trap of it being an individualized approach to what this future might look like. So we spent a lot of time trying to describe changes in practices in this future. So we hope you will like the cartoon. And the goal of the cartoon was to see whether people can engage differently with the energy transition when it is related in a way that makes that is more resonates with them and their own lives.
Great, thanks. We'll add it to the reading, the bookshelves in the ship. Yeah. Okay, so we'd like to know where to go next. Is there somebody else on the map you'd like to send us to visit?
Yes. Have you thought about visiting Bente Halkier? She has done a lot of interesting work on food consumption.
We could visit Bente. She's in Copenhagen. Yeah. That's by the sea.
Margit Keller also. I don't know if you know her. We worked together on a paper looking at the links between social practice theory and the multi-level perspective. And I think she's also very committed to
I'm up in the crow's nest. I don't think I can take that. Let's go to Copenhagen, or let's see. Okay, thanks.
My pleasure. Have a
Thanks
good
very much.
continuation of your trip. Come back
Yeah.
and visit soon.
Yeah.